morning and or evening. Today is Wednesday, the 22nd of July, 2020. I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology podcast, Stumbling Block. And I have good news for the listeners out there. I have a horrible cold. Now that, well, I don't have a horrible cold. I have a cold. Now, that normally wouldn't be good news, but it's really good news in this case because it's not corona.
That is good.
How, might you ask, do I know it's not corona?
You got tested?
I actually did not get myself tested. However, I was interviewing for the possibility of an apartment next year. Mm-hmm. And all of my potential flatmates were getting sick. I am getting sick. Said flatmates, two of them who were getting sick, as the others were tested for corona. It came back negative this afternoon.
Good.
Peter, I have to tell you, I've never been so happy to receive the common cold in my entire life.
I believe it.
So that's my good news. I have the cold. It's not corona. I mean, I could get myself tested, but I don't see the necessity when the people that I've been in contact with who are sick have been declared that they do not have corona.
Right, I get that.
So I don't know. What may change it is if I developed some other weird symptom, but, you know, it just feels like your basic cold. Unfortunately, I have to take a Hebrew exam on Friday. I'd rather not do that when ill, so, you know.
You'd probably rather not do that when not ill, either.
I have to think about that one. It's not the Hebrew itself. I think I'm the kind of person I will use Hebrew now for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. It is the formality and the nervousness that goes into an exam, and I'm not sure if I will pass it this time around. Now, if I don't pass it, I'll take it again, and you know, I'm working on those backup plans in order to secure that. I'm confident I'd pass it the second time without a problem. I'd like to pass it the first time just to have the formality out of the way, so I can sit in on a really fun exegesis of the Joseph story next semester by the Hebrew professor on the faculty.
Oh, fun.
And entirely be doing it for fun, not be doing it for more practice to retake a Hebraicum.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be fun either way, but I'd like it to be 100% fun. Mm-hmm. Doctoral students aren't supposed to have fun, but I'd like to. So yes, but I have a Hebrew exam in 2 days, so pray for me. I need the mercy of the Lord. And I will report on if I passed it or not. I think it could go either way. I love my BDB. It's my new best friend. For those of you who have not studied Hebrew, because the Lutheran seminaries are shifting in this regard. It's not a shift I agree with, as we've talked about before, but for those of you who haven't, the BDB is the standard Hebrew-English lexicon that is translated from the German Gesenius. Excuse me while I brag, I have both. The German Gesenius and the English BDB, and I'm so happy. Peter, can you tell I like Hebrew?
Yeah.
And I think actually for Lutherans, this is the argument I would make. I would say Hebrew is the most important language for us to learn, and I'm not talking about any kind of fluency. Right. I'm talking about a basic working knowledge of it, which I would say I have, by the way, but just because I have a basic working knowledge does not mean I will pass an exam in Tübingen.
Right.
Those are two different things.
Yeah.
But what I would argue, Lutherans need a basic working command of the language, because we so badly misused the Hebrew scriptures during World War II. Mm-hmm. And even Luther himself, in the places where he rails against the Jews, the Hebrew language is a way to correct some of that. So I would say it's the most important for us. That may be a slightly unusual argument. It's not entirely just because I'm having a lot of fun doing Hebrew. Mm-hmm. it is really because I really do believe that was a catastrophic failure on the part of Lutherans during World War II, German Lutherans specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, in the name of never again, we ought to be not only teaching Hebrew, but I really would say requiring it, but requiring it in perhaps in an American context in a different way than that word is usually meant.
Right.
In other words, not to terrorize people with Hebrew, but to open up the possibilities for how it changes the way we read the Hebrew Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what that looks like, but I do think we have gone the wrong way as Lutherans from the American context by not requiring it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just us as the Lutherans. The Ivies don't require it either, and I also think that's a mistake.
Right, right.
I think there is a way to say, yes, you need to do this, but we're not going to terrorize you with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see why this needs to be an either or. I think it can be a both and.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to expect you to do this, but I'm not sure American students need the level of exam that I'm taking over here.
Right.
Which is written... You need what?
We need to know how to use the resources available to us.
Oh, I would say a little more than that.
Right, but I'm just saying, like, at a bare minimum, good that like, you know what I mean, that knowing how to use concordance with the Hebrew, knowing how to use the BGB, knowing how to use a lexicon.
But I would say also knowing when you look at a verb to know it's a PL, a hifel, a hitpael, all of that basic knowledge. I think that is needed as well, and to have a basic vocabulary.
Okay.
In addition to being able to use the tools.
Right.
What tends to happen is students get taught the tools, but they're not actually taught the language.
Right, right.
And that actually doesn't help you. All it does is make you dependent on the tools. Mm-hmm. And the tools are great. I love accordance. I've spent way too much money on accordance in the last 7 years. We're not going to tell people how much money I've spent on accordance in the last 7 years.
Oh, we're not going to tell people how much money I've spent on it either.
Yeah. Accordance is great. But what I've discovered in my own work is accordance can become the clutch.
Mm-hmm.
Or not the clutch, the crutch.
Yeah,
the crutch. God, I can't even speak English today. How am I going to speak German?
Maybe your German will be better.
There is some truth to that. But I do think there is this is, for me, a particularly Protestant emphasis, but it's also a Roman Catholic emphasis since particularly the Second Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. But I think there is something to be said. We really need to know the biblical languages.
Right.
And more than just knowing the tools, perhaps not as much as what Tübingen requires of its diploma students. I think there's a middle ground between those two.
Okay.
And that would be what I would argue needs to happen, because I'm a little worried about the prospect of a pastor preaching from a text when he, she, or they have never consulted the original languages behind the translation that they're preaching from. Mm-hmm. I'm a little worried about that. Mm-hmm. Translations are problematic. Translators themselves admit that they're problematic.
Right.
Some kind of working knowledge of the original language is helpful. I feel the same way now about Luther. Reading Luther. Matter of fact, I forgot that I was a subscriber to Luther's works still. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, the newest edition of Luther's works showed up in the mail in my cubby the other day. And it's this big old thick book of disputations from the 1530s and onward, right? Big old, it's the thickest book of Luther's works I think I've seen. And I I had this slight feeling for the first time in my life of this is not really Luther. This needs to be consulted in the Latin. And I'm not good enough at Latin yet. That's next semester's project. If I pass the Hebrew exam, I can move on to Latin. I'm not good enough at Latin to do that kind of work. But I still have the notion of this isn't really Luther. This is good to have. Particularly if you're doing English essays and so on, you want to be able to cite an authoritative translation for English readers. But if you really want to read Luther, you've got to go back to the Latin and to the German. And that's a particularly Tübingen emphasis.
Right.
But I think it's correct, actually. If you just want to use Luther, then it's not so much of a problem. But if you actually want to, reading the translation, but if you actually want to exegete him and interpret him, you've got to have some work with the original languages. Now, I cleverly, in my own dissertation, actually picked all Luther texts that were written in German, except for a couple that are written in Latin. And obviously, I won't really start trying to work with those deeply until I've had more Latin. But the German ones are no problem because, yes, it's different German than modern German, but it's so close to modern German at the end of the day that those are not the problem for me.
Right.
But it's really, that is something I worry about in theological education in the States, is that there is not enough consulting of the original languages.
Well, and that again gets back to the difference between what we've talked about before, academic and practical degrees.
Then I would go so far as to say an MDiv degree should not be called a master's degree.
There are a lot of people who'd agree with you.
Yeah. I don't know what to call it. Some kind of certificate or something. But I think this kind of work in the languages, and again, this is nowhere near fluency. This is just being able to consult them, to be able to work in them, to, this is not saying that, it would be really imperialistic to say it. This is not saying you got to be able to speak German to read Luther. That would be ridiculous. But just a little bit of knowledge for Lutherans of these languages would, I think, benefit the practical application. But what do you think?
I think you'd be holding Lutheran pastors to a standard no other denomination holds their pastors to. In the world. In the world.
No. Well, frankly, German pastors can do everything I'm saying. Because they're trained that way.
In the Latin?
Yeah. They can at least work with it. You have to pass a Latinum to get your theology diploma.
Fascinating.
Yes. German, Latin, Greek, Hebrew. You have to have, German because it's just a native language, like English for us. That's no big deal. For them. Yeah. Latin, Greek, Hebrew. You cannot be a pastor without those three languages. And if you fail the Latin and Greek exam twice, or you fail the Hebrew exam 3 times, you are kicked out of your theological studies. You are not allowed to continue at a state university.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, certainly we'd be holding it to a standard no other denomination in the United States holds them to.
Really? The number of Presbyterian pastors that I know that can read Greek and read Hebrew?
Well, but what you're talking about is Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and German.
The Latin and German is if you, I think for Lutherans would be important because of our foundational documents and how they relate to the wider ecumenical church.
Right, but certainly we should be requiring Greek and Hebrew. I agree with that 100%. No questions. I think it's okay to punt to the experts on Latin and German. To say that that's a PhD level thing, at least in the United States.
But how do you then say, and this is not just a question for Luther scholars and systematicians, but the wider church and the role that Latin played in the wider church. Let's bracket German for a minute. That German may be the one that you could punt to the experts. But Latin? How do you... And if we're talking about standards, the number of Catholic priests that can read Latin, how do you get away from that? And by the way, I'm talking about Catholic priests in the United States.
Right, which Catholic Germany. Priests in the United States have something much more approaching a PhD level education.
I think that's what we ought to have as Protestants as well.
A PhD level education.
Something approaching it, yes. If it's truly going to be a master's degree, yes. Not any kind of a dissertation, but in terms of, and I'm being easy. Tübingen's language standards for us as Americans are insane. Mm. By the way, they're being nice to me. I don't have to do a Latinum. I have to take an exam in Church Latin. I'll translate something from the Vulgate, or maybe some text of Luther, or something like that, what I would have done in Chicago. Mm-hmm. They're being nice to me. They're not making me do the full exam. Mm-hmm. They could.
Yeah.
But because I didn't come from the German system, I was allowed, because I was a PhD student, I was allowed to do an equivalence proofing, they call it. Mm-hmm. Same with Greek, because I had some Greek at PLTS. I'll translate from the New Testament rather than doing. But what Tübingen makes its pastoral students do, you don't just have to Koine Greek, you have to do classical Greek.
Oh wow!
Yup, you're translating Plato for your exam. You're not translating the Gospel of John. So I'm not arguing for that kind of a standard. I don't think that's realistic. But I think some work in those languages would benefit us in the American context quite a bit.
Then you're looking at adding at least another year, if not two, to an already lengthy degree process.
Well, I'm not sure it adds 2 years, and I will say in Germany they spend 6 years. Now, granted, they don't have this undergraduate master's system that we have. Mm-hmm. But they spend 6 years studying theology. We can barely get students to take 3 years without complaining.
Well, part of the complaint is the system of funding in the United States.
Right. And so that's the biggest. That's why I'm saying not the same standards that Germany has, but some kind of, you can do intensive courses. I don't know how you did your Greek, but I did my Greek as a 6-week intensive.
I did my Greek as a 6-week intensive, but I did it after taking almost a year of weekly Greek lessons.
That's probably the better way than what I did. I'll be reviewing that, but first comes Hebrew. Mm-hmm. But we're going the opposite way in the States. We're dropping everything. Mm-hmm. And we're calling it a master's degree, a Master of Divinity. We're dropping all the languages, including at Yale, although there is apparently a club of students who read Latin at Yale. But there was the same kind of thing at LSTC. There were a group of students who gathered with a teacher who did it for free. He just loved Latin. It was an older gentleman. He came in and taught Latin to whomever wanted to take it. I didn't take it at the time. Why, I don't know. I really wish I would have.
Yeah.
But I didn't. But we're dropping everything. Mm-hmm. And even at the PhD level, by the way, you can get into theology programs without Greek and Hebrew. I didn't have to have Greek to get into any doctoral program that I applied to in the States.
Wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, if you're in Bible, they expect you to have Greek and Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're in like church history at the doctoral level, then they'll want you to do Latin
Mm-hmm.
and German,
Right.
or Latin and French, or sometimes Latin, German, and French.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lucky that I don't have to worry about French at the moment. That's actually the common two European languages, if it's not Spanish,
Right.
is
Right.
German and French. At the
Oui, tu ne
doctoral
parles
level.
pas le français?
Yeah, no. No. I'll gladly say that to you in German if you want, but that probably won't really answer your question. Um, and I also realize you can't learn all the languages of the world. I
No.
get that. I really get that. But I think it makes sense for Lutherans to have German, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And that's what the Missouri Synod does. Those Missouri Synod guys, they can read German, they can read Latin, and I guarantee you they can read Greek and Hebrew. And very rarely do I compliment the Missouri Synod, but on this one, I will compliment them. I think they're right. And I think we have gone the wrong way in the ELCA. We have sold out that kind of work to the more conservative denominations.
Mm-hmm.
And we end up, and by the way, I do this too as a systematician and would have continued doing this had I not come to Germany. We argue from translations.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, we double click a button in accordance to find out what something means, and then we pretend like we actually understand it.
Yeah.
And accordance has been kind of saving my life in Hebrew this semester, because I'm like, what on earth is that thing? And I don't say it so kindly. I say it much more in a vulgar manner that I won't repeat on the air.
Yeah. I know that I, for one, have gotten into arguments with certain translations and certain things that if you don't actually dig into the Thayer or whatever, the sort of just initial pop-up on accordance, I've been like, I'm not sure. Of course, my biggest thing is I have gotten into arguments with people over. Okay, so backing up a little bit, I took French in college.
Oh God, how many languages do you know? My God, you can speak Latin, Greek and Hebrew, French. You got more on there?
God, I have a smattering of Spanish. I know when I'm being insulted in Spanish.
Well, that's all you need. Can you swear in Spanish?
A little bit.
Well, there you go. Then you're on the right way.
And I can at least know what I'm ordering at most restaurants. if the description's in Spanish. But so at one point in time I was fluent enough in French to have a disagreement with the subtitles in the movie Amelie.
I mean, that's excellent. But back to your comment about arguing in the Bible.
Well, so but my point here is that I don't know what my point there was. Never mind. I lost it. Hold up. Go ahead.
Can I be bold and maybe guess at what your point might have been?
Sure.
The only way you can get into arguments with somebody is if you have a basic command of the biblical languages in order to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I absolutely agree. We need to have a basic command of the biblical languages.
I think Latin, too, because of church doctrine. We are Lutherans. We are a confessional tradition that is written, by the way, in Latin and German. The Book of Concord is not written in English.
Yeah.
We know that, obviously. Probably almost all of our listeners know that. But how many parishioners know that?
Right. And I think so. Here's where I would sort of my compromise question mark on that is I think that should be part of D-Min work. And I think more pastors should have a D-Min.
I think more pastors should have PhDs.
Well,
anyway.
That too, but I'm just saying. But
a
it shouldn't.
A D-Min has no language requirements.
Right, which is awful. But I don't think Latin and German should be a barrier to entering the pastorate.
Yes, and I apologize. I have misspoken. if I have implied that. It is German, bracket German, because for Tübingen, these folks in Tübingen studying theology, German is it's their native language, right? Most of them.
Yeah.
Or they're so freaking fluent in it that it might as well be their native language, or they're on their way to becoming fluent in it. I'm talking about the people doing the equivalent of an MDiv here.
Yeah.
Then there's little old me who's trying to learn German at 32 going, why didn't I do this 12 years ago? Anyway, I did. I took German in college, but and then it's always been a part of my life. It's been a part of my life since I started university in some form.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not fluent. I'm not going to overestimate my own abilities, but so many of the people here, it's just in the air for them. So let's bracket that. Latin is a barrier here. You have to have that. I also do not think in the American context it would make sense to make that a barrier to the pastorate. And I certainly don't think German would be a barrier to the pastorate. But I still think there ought to be some, and not necessarily with German, but with Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, some kind of, you need to do this. And it's not going to be a 2-week thing where you goof off the whole time and you do nothing.
Right. No,
you
absolutely.
need to do this.
Well, no, that's what I think. I think it'd be good if there were resources for more pastors to, once you've gotten started in the parish, to have more continuing education for pastors.
Can you imagine? I'm just imagining continuing education being Latin. I can imagine the eye rolls at that one. And it's a bit sad, right? I mean, because you're talking about continuing education, but you're talking about a D-Min. But the second you start adding a language requirement to a D-Min, you've turned it into a PhD.
Have I? Okay,
yeah,
then.
You've turned it into a PhD in practical theology.
Fine, then.
So you think more pastors should have PhDs in practical theology?
Yes.
I think more pastors ought to have PhDs in anything. I don't care if it's cognitive neuroscience, but some kind of something. But that will never fly in our denomination.
I know.
I mean, there are pastors who have PhDs.
Right.
But why isn't it more common then? You don't want to get a PhD, I might remind you.
I don't. It's true. I'm also not a pastor anymore.
But you were.
I was, and the more I've moved on from that life, the more I'm like, you know what? I think ultimately, if there would have been a way for me to do a PhD from distance with financial support from the synod, it would have been a good idea further down the line.
Got 4 letters for you. LSTC.
What about them?
I think that's a great place to do that very kind of thing.
Right, but we aren't providing financial support for our pastors to do it.
Tell me about it. I've paid my own way through graduate school until now, until this last year. Yeah. I've paid my own way for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
I was going to say, how's that going for you?
Well, right now it's great because of Corona, and I have a scholarship now. And I am deeply grateful for that. But when did I come to Tübingen? 2019? Is that when I came?
Sounds...
Something like that.
Something like that.
The first
2018. 2018.
No, that was when I met Jürgen Maltman.
Okay.
I came as first an exchange student in 2019, and then I switched.
Yeah. I've had your hoodie since 2018.
You need to send me that hoodie.
I need to find that hoodie.
Yeah, well, Peter has my Luther Seminary hoodie that I got for $1 when the bookstore closed.
Yep.
And I would very much enjoy wearing that hoodie around Tübingen because I have no shame that I went to seminaries. But I think the Germans are right to critique not only seminaries, right, but any American university that requires no work in languages. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate to have to do Greek but I never had to do Hebrew. And, Peter, this is the worst thing. I was persuaded by this argument of the MDiv being a practical degree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't need Hebrew to be practical.
Yeah, you do.
Absolutely you do. Hebrew will help your preaching, as will Greek. Frankly, I would say as will Latin. I know you don't like that.
Well, I mean, okay, so I think part of my thing, right? If we're gonna tunnel real deep into where I think you ought to be learning Latin, it's not in college.
It's in elementary school
or middle school.
Yeah, that's the way you learned it.
Yep. You know what? What I didn't have to worry about for the SAT?
What?
My vocabulary.
Of course not. So much of English is rooted in Latin or its derivative, French.
Right, especially the polysyllabic words.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they'd throw a word at me, I could break it down by roots and figure it out. Boom.
Of course. Of course. I agree with you totally. And frankly, and this is not, I have to be careful that it's my own context and my own feeling of inferiority at the moment, but in my ideal world, we'd all be speaking Latin. Would make my life so much easier as a scholar. Oh my God. We'd all just, it'd be so great.
Yep.
For me as a theologian.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like, I'm a lover of languages. I am an amateur linguist. I could have gotten out of taking a language in college. I could have tested out for Latin. But I chose not to and took the opportunity to learn French.
Good for you. I wish I knew French because I'm using Derrida in my dissertation, and you might ask me, well, doesn't that contradict everything you said about consulting the original languages? But the only reason that I'm not losing sleep at night over this is because I'm not exegeting Derrida.
Right.
I'm just using a concept of Derrida for my work and then taking it in my own directions for method.
Mm-hmm.
And that I can certainly look up in a French dictionary. That's no problem.
Right.
Yeah, to do French, good for you.
Which again, I did it. So this is to sort of further support your point, actually. The reason I took French is because I wanted to be a film major.
You wanted to meet Juliette Binoche or something?
Well, so much of the really important early work in film was done in France. The early writings and critiques on film were done in French.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
And so I took French to be able to engage that in the original language. Now, I never got fluent enough to be able to do so. And I ended up switching from film to media, which is much more American.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
In particular, I focused on radio and television.
That's why you like my headphones that I use.
Yeah.
Oh, plug to our listeners, I use Sony MDR 7506 headphones that I've had for 4 years, but somehow forgot to tell Peter that I had them.
Yep.
And he told me they were all over when he was a media major.
Oh, absolutely.
They're wonderful. I love them.
They're great. They're great for recording and stuff like that. Myself, I have Grado SR80Es, which is sort of the bottom end of decent Grados.
Yeah, you like the open backs. I tend to like the closed back.
Right. Well, it's a difference in what we listen to on our headphones.
I listen to choral music and Glenn Gould and Beethoven symphonies and Arnold Schoenberg and yeah.
And I listen to Jaco Pastorius and Led Zeppelin and Cake.
I listen to Ed Sheeran. Does that count?
I don't know, does it?
You be the judge of that. You know more about pop music than I do.
I have mixed feelings about Ed Sheeran.
Apparently, he's quite anti-feminist in some of his songs.
Yeah.
You told me that. Of course, he's also, interestingly, quite pro-life. On his first album, he has the song "Small Bump,"
Mm-hmm.
and that's a pro-life song. I think we spoke about that on here before a couple of years ago, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting mix for him because he's such a sexual libertarian, shall I say, or something like that. That was me trying to put it politely.
Yes.
These languages. Why would you say that seminary would be a bad place to learn Latin?
I think it's too late.
If you're just gonna consult a text of Luther or Aquinas or something,
Right, I think seminary is too late to be learning a second language.
I'm not talking about a second language. I'm talking about a research language.
Right, but okay. So me, in my ideal world, your first second language you learn is either Spanish or Latin.
Not French.
No, French is a little more advanced.
Yeah, but they're all Spanish and French are derivatives of Latin.
Right, but Spanish and Latin are much more straightforward than French. In terms of their grammar and in terms of spelling and things like that.
Okay.
In both Spanish and Latin, you pronounce every letter in the word.
I mean, I'm trying to think if I know. Hoc est corpus meum.
This is my body.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, you pronounce every letter in the word. You don't pronounce every letter in the word in French.
Verbum caro factus est. Factus or factum?
I think it's the object.
Caro factum est.
I would say it's the.
Factum.
I think it's the object, so it would be factum.
Yeah, factum. Verbum caro factum est.
Word something is truth.
The word became flesh.
Became flesh. Reality. The word became embodied.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Let's see.
That is an interesting translation choice.
Really?
Right. No, really. Because there are other words for flesh in Latin.
Yeah. Well, what would those be? Sarx? Nope, that's Greek.
No, that's Greek. I'm trying to remember now. But you could have done something more meaty.
I've got a Middle Ages choral tune in my head when I said that. I mean, my exposure to Latin was choral music. Credo in unum Deum.
Faith in the one God. I believe in one God.
Yeah. Et resurrexit tertia die, secundum scripturam. Scripturas, rather, right?
He rose on the third day in accordance with Scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crucifixus. Wait a minute. Sub Poncio Pilato.
Poncio, so there's something about Pilate washing his hands.
No. Crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Okay, yeah. Okay. The part of it, right? I learned proper Latin pronunciation, not medieval Latin pronunciation.
Sorry, I do church Latin pronunciation and Italian. Yeah, Italian choral Latin pronunciation.
Yeah.
So, crucifixus Poncio Pilato.
Yeah, crucifixus sub Poncio Pilato.
Sub Poncio.
Sub.
Really? Wow, church Latin really is different.
Yes, it really is.
I mean, whether I want it or not, church Latin is in my bones because of choral music.
Right.
I mean, I mean that literally. It is in my bones.
Mm-hmm. But so my point being, when you get to seminary, you really should already have the framework for learning grammar in another language.
But that
That would be
implies
so
that,
massively helpful.
but that implies that high schools and universities in America are teaching languages, and we both know that that's not happening
Anymore. I was required to take a language in high school. I was required to take a language in college.
I took Spanish in high school. Believe it or not, I never say it, but I had 4 years of Spanish
Okay.
in high school.
Yeah.
I don't know if that counts for anything.
Well, but you learned about the accusative form. You learned about the nominative form. You learned about past, present, and how to differentiate between them in verb tenses.
Yeah, but I never really understood that until I studied German. Now I understand that.
Right, but you had the vocabulary.
So why don't I remember any of it?
I don't know. I can't help you with that. But my point is, one of the most frustrating things for me in Greek at seminary was the number of people who didn't even have the vocabulary for learning a second language.
Nominative, accusative, dative, genitive. Sorry, I'm switching into my German pronunciation now.
That's fine, but I know what you mean. But yeah, no, they didn't even know what they didn't even understand genitive.
Well, yeah, the construct state in Hebrew is the genitive,
Right.
but or the dativus ethicus, the ethical dative
Right.
in Hebrew.
Yeah.
I see, because of this whole class is in German, I've learned all these German and Latin terms for Hebrew.
Right.
So I keep going, status constructus, status absolutus. And then I try to say, what the hell does that mean in English, Brach? It's very interesting, Peter.
It is very interesting. But so people reach seminary and are trying to learn. And that's the big part, right? I think it would be possible to do more with languages in seminary if we came to seminary with the vocabulary of learning language.
But it's not that hard to teach somebody what an accusative and a dative is.
You say that.
And a genitive.
You say that, but think back to your Greek class. Think back to some of the people who struggled in your Greek class.
Well, I may have been one of them, but I was struggling for personal problems unrelated to Greek. I mean, I don't know. For me, it's German. The gift of German, even though I'm not fluent, I'm not. It's going to take probably 3-4 years until I would be at that level. Mm-hmm. I think. Mm-hmm. Now, I tend to understate and underestimate in order to make sure I give myself time. Mm-hmm. But for me, German was where I learned all of this. I may have had the vocabulary in high school, but it wasn't until I really began looking at the German language in college that I understood that.
But that's still in college.
I mean, look, my German teacher, he's dead now, so it doesn't matter. My German teacher in college was really not good, frankly.
That's tragic.
I learned more in 6 weeks of 2 intensive courses at Vivat Lingua in Tübingen than I did in 2 years of college German.
That's tragic.
The reason is, at Vivat Lingua, they only spoke German to me.
Yeah, and my French teacher in college almost entirely spoke French to us.
That makes all the difference in the world. Now, I may be understating things. I may have, because I tend to do that in general, mm-hmm. I may have learned more in college German than I think I did.
Yeah, but my point being, you at least learned about verb tenses, you learned about noun states.
Yes, of course.
But what I'm saying is that people made it to seminary without knowing that.
But how?
And that's why it's difficult to add language requirements in America.
But I still don't think, okay, and I'm not just trying to be obtuse, but it may seem like it, but I'm really not. I don't think it's that hard to teach somebody that the accusative is the direct object.
You would think so, but brother, I've sat through classes where people didn't get that.
I mean, I guess I don't know, and I'm in a totally different experience, right? Because even though with my close friends in Germany, I tend to speak English with them. That is, in some ways, that is a mistake. In some ways, that is appropriate. But apart from my close friends, I'm speaking German every day. I'm reading German every day.
Right.
And for instance, Oswald Bayer has this lovely little book called Autorität und Kritik. And it's a little book on methodology and the cross and theology of science and all that. And I picked it up. I mean, I've had the book for a couple months, but I actually looked into it to see if I wanted to use it for my own methodology. And I decided, of course, yes. This was not a hard decision. Because, I love Oswald Bayer for many reasons, not just because he's a lovely person, but because he's a brilliant, brilliant Luther scholar and systematician. And I picked up his book and I just started reading it. And I didn't have to pick up a dictionary. And did I get every single word? Of course not. That's why I say I'm not fluent. But I got a great majority of those first pages that I was reading without consulting a dictionary. That is not what I am asking that seminaries require.
I understand. I know that. But what I'm saying is that the amount of work that goes into that it takes to teach American students languages, because we do so little language work in high school, in anywhere along the way. Elementary school, middle school, high school, college. We do so little language work. That it becomes, by the time you get to seminary, people don't know how to learn a language. People don't know how to learn how to interact with a foreign language.
I wonder if some of this too, I'm holding what you just said, but it's because of interacting with foreign language. I wonder if some of this for me had to do with that I studied music.
Yeah.
And that, not that I knew Italian, and I hate French, by the way. Sorry, Derrida, may he rest in peace, but I hate French. I've never liked it. I hate to sing in it. I can't pronounce it. It makes no sense to me. When I say I hate French, I actually love the sound of it. I hate trying to reproduce that myself because I always fail. Makes no sense.
Oui, c'est une langue difficile.
Sure, whatever you just said.
It's a difficult language.
Well, okay, yeah, sure, but I had to sing in all those languages. I had to sing in Italian, in German, in French, in Latin, in Spanish, but not solo. So Latin and Spanish were in choral music.
Right.
Latin and Spanish in choral music. German, Italian, and French in solo music.
And that leaves your language sector of your brain more plastic.
Why? I was no good at French. I was terrible at French.
Well, but the other ones, all of that kept you hearing and producing different vowel sounds. Right? So think about, like, people you know who grew up somewhere and still, even though they haven't lived there for years, still sound like they're from there.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I've talked about this with myself before. I don't have a native accent. And because I've moved so much across the country. I moved from Oregon to Tennessee to Minnesota to Kansas to Michigan to Wisconsin.
I didn't know you were in Oregon.
That's where I was born.
How did I not know this?
Yeah. I was born in Springfield, Oregon.
Wow. Okay.
So, I don't have a native accent. I replicate the accent of people around me. There are a few words that I say in an accent, very few, and it's not consistent which accent I say them in. every state I've lived in, I say like I'm from there. Like, even though right now I'm talking in what would normally be considered a fairly normal Wisconsin accent, I'll still say Tennessee.
Really? I'd say Tennessee.
Yeah, no, it's Tennessee.
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 Yep.
Did I do it right?
Yep.
Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
And this relates to what we were talking about. Where
the plasticity of your brain. Because we don't teach languages in schools, the language center of your brain has firmly set up by the time you get to seminary. And so it becomes incredibly difficult to learn another language if you haven't maintained the plasticity of your language center.
How does studying music maintain that? Because you hear all those sounds?
Right, because you've sung in those languages. You've heard, even hearing and producing those sounds keeps your language centers plastic.
Interesting. And again, maybe I was better in all of this than I'm giving myself credit for. I mean, it was a long time ago. It's nearly a decade ago since I graduated from university.
Yeah.
I mean...
But I actually got a talking to in my Hebrew class because my language center is so plastic, I can hear the difference between and
Well, yeah, of course. So can I.
Most people can't.
Yeah, but I can hear that because I have a degree in music.
Exactly. But most people can't tell the difference between a forward guttural and a rear guttural. And so when I was working with my classmates, I had to use a huh. I can't even do it the way I was supposed to because I want to guttural it so badly correctly. I couldn't do a huh instead of a huh.
You mean a hey versus a chet?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can hear that difference, of course.
Right, but I was doing a hey versus a chet.
Yeah. I can hear that difference too.
Most people can't.
Well, that's the great thing about Hebrew is Hebrew is a very musical language.
Yeah, I can almost pronounce Aleph.
Ah, see, I didn't actually learn the correct way. Aleph.
Aleph.
Olive.
Aleph.
Olive.
No, a little too much, but yeah.
Olive.
Aleph. It's a hard start.
Olive.
Yeah, there you go.
It's a gut. Yeah, it's really a guttural.
It is Aleph.
Olive.
Yeah.
Olive.
Yep.
Now, is that modern Hebrew or is that biblical Hebrew? I know there's a difference.
I'm not sure. I'm guessing biblical because I never learned modern.
Okay, so we didn't so much learn the those nuances. I kind of wish we would have, but I can certainly hear them when you're saying them.
Right. Most people can't, and most people can't reproduce them.
Did I reproduce it decently?
You did okay.
It's got to be the music training.
Well, exactly. It's because it left your language center more plastic.
I wish somebody would have told me this when I was like 18, that studying music actually would have been somewhat advantageous. I mean, I was no good at music theory. My challenge to myself is in my spare time after my doctorate to work through a music theory textbook again and just brush my skills up, because I'm hearing all this classical music via Adagio. If you don't know Adagio, you must. It's the Spotify for classical music. The metadata is terrific. And it's lossless audio. It's wonderful. But I'm hearing all this music in Adagio. I'm going, well, dang nabbit, I don't know what the chord changes are in this song, and I want to.
Yeah.
To which a friend of mine who also has a music degree told me I was officially an overachiever. I said, what do you expect? I'm getting a PhD.
Right. Well, on that note, we should wrap it up.
All right. Next week, more useless information coming to you.
All right.
I'm Brach Jennings.
I'm Peter Clark.
And this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology, language-loving podcast, Stumbling Block.
Stumbling Block is a production of Silver Turkey Studios. Our Patreon producer is Ben Dittman, our executive producer is Peter Clark, and our executive director is Brach Jennings. Our theme music is by Mirrors for Windows, and we are hosted by Podbean. We can be reached by email at stumblingblockpodcast@gmail.com. Please consider supporting us at patreon.com/stumblingBlock. And as always, thank you for listening.